Hi guys, this is Alexandra Bartfeld and you're watching the Organ Talk. And I'm so excited. I'm sure that you are very excited too. I think this is going to be a very special evening today. I really hope you will stay with us till the end. And I just can't wait. So I think we're ready, guys. This is Cameron Carpenter.
Hey, you there, Alexandra?
Hi Cameron.
Hey.
How are you? Nice to see you. Thank you so much for taking your time and joining us today.
Oh, my pleasure. My pleasure.
I have so many questions to you, and everybody has just endless list of questions they sent me.
Let's get into it. I'm ready to rumble.
Let's get into it. You was talking on a previous interview with Lucas about starting a career, and it was actually very, very important for all the younger people who are just at the beginning.
Sure.
And I actually wanted to ask you about your experience as you started, as you were a student. By the way, being a child, you've definitely been very gifted in music, but have you been very gifted in different fields also, or it was only the music which you were doing the most?
No, I'm not a well-rounded person or talent. There are comparatively few things I'm interested in, much less enough to spend any amount of effort on them. And so the only thing, the kind of the only thing in my life really is music and the organ, with some form of sort of amateur athletics coming a distant second. But as far as early days, I was homeschooled. I was born in 1981, so I'll be 40 next year. So again, next to some of the folks who are, coming up with the organ now, I'm already pretty old, but, well, not to joke about it, but old enough to have had my career formation since I started quite young in a totally different era. So, a lot of disclaimers with talking about young careers from me. Two disclaimers is that, my history and my past and my career have been, if not unique, highly unusual. So naturally they won't necessarily apply. It doesn't mean I have really necessarily any advice for anybody. I always try to give the best advice I can, but I can only talk about, from my experience, and my experience has been pretty unusual. But then also, the landscape has changed again so much, not only with the pandemic, but even just in the last, 10 years, 5 years, 2 years, as we all know.
Sure.
So that I don't know that anything, I said as much to Lucas in those interviews, I don't know if I were starting my career today with the same skill set, the tape would not play the same way. It's, and in that sense, every career is an evolution. It's heavily influenced by chaotic factors that will not repeat in the same way. So just keep that in mind as we're talking about stuff, because there's no advice I have to give that's in any way sacred or definitive.
Yeah, I mean, in this case, everyone's career is very unique, and then questioning anyone will be a special experience and not a really an advice, but something to take into consideration.
Yeah, well, but the thing that I do think is helpful maybe about talking with my career is that I have spent a lot of, even most of my career, in areas that most organists don't get to work, or if they work there, it's only a very small part of their output. And yet that area, particularly the broader concert stage and dealing with the general public rather than either the classical music world, let alone even the organ world, but just the general public audience, that is an area that really hasn't had, much interaction with the organ, for quite a long time, depending on how you count. And so I do have some, I have some experience. It wouldn't be the same kind of thing as a conservatory professor by any means, but I have some, I have working hours as somebody who's just worked in the business with that, with that kind of audience. that is not usually something that most organists can speak to. So that can be useful. But of course, it contains a lot of harsh realities too.
True. And talking about that, last winter I was interviewing Louis Robillard, and he was talking a lot about his experience meeting you as a student to one of the master classes. Yeah, and I have a quote I want to read out to you, and I want to know what's your opinion on that. No, it's nothing.
A quote from Robillard?
Yeah.
Oh my. Okay.
So he said, it isn't easy to work with students like this, meaning like Cameron Carpenter. Even at school, they already have a bad reputation. At such a young age, they are already too much off the beaten track, way too different from the others. How should a teacher work with them? The most important thing is to channel their talent into the right direction.
Yeah.
And for you, what would be a right direction?
For me, or just in general?
Yeah, what will be your opinion? Because I think it's pretty clear what the right direction for Robillard would be, because we know his opinion is very classical and going back to classical school. And what was your opinion?
Yeah, but I mean, but it's interesting with Robillard because, you know, Robillard to me is one of the most real players there is. And it's interesting. I only spent about a week with Robillard. We never properly studied, but he did hugely influence me. Just watching, and one of the things is, you know, that was great for me. I was 17, 18. I guess I was 18. And he came down to North Carolina. I was a student at the North Carolina School of the Arts, and a lot of people will know there's a 1977 Fisk 3-manual tracker organ there. Pretty harsh one. I spent, as all of the NCSA kids do, you know, we spend years on that organ. I used to get up at 5:45 to practice in Crawford Hall before the 8 o'clock class. And you know, the organ has no combination action. So I was running stops for him during his concert, and just to get to see the technique, he actually played from scores because the complicated registrations, you know. So we were, you know, I was just getting to see how he would work with this organ that I thought I knew pretty well. And then we had a kind of some separate private, actually, frankly, rather secret lessons on the off hours on a 4-manual, a 1928 EM Skinner, which was the organ that I really liked. And we mostly worked on Liszt. And because I was studying the complete works at the time, because I was going through a Liszt phase. And yeah, he just, you know, when I think of Robillard, I don't think of a conservative player. I think of somebody who's actually, you know, was at the time, seemed to me, on the very vanguard of what it is to be a natural artist at the organ. He's somebody who I would consider a high-level artist, whereas I think of myself more as an engineer, and somebody who is in the tradition, organist-wise, more of the matinee organist of the 1920s and 30s, who would be playing at a cathedral and doing also concert work, and would also be the organist at a theater and probably play for vaudeville shows and movies and stuff. Somebody like Firmin Swinnin is an important organist for me, who, you know, was the organist at Longwood Gardens and also the Rialto Theater in New York, who, you know, would have an all-round talent group. And so, you know, Robillard really helped to push me in that direction. But he also taught me a lot about how to disregard and shed and not be affected by the criticisms of others. There was another teacher at the same seminar where I met Louis Robillard, who was very negative about my work and who also had me in a public master class for the same pieces, which was useful because I got to see not only two different points of view, but I got to see the various hypocrisies and sycophancies that will accumulate amongst the hangers-on of these people, because of course that teacher had his own sort of clack or clique. Both words are interchangeable as far as I'm concerned. And so, you know, you get to see not only the way they play, but also how they conduct themselves politically. And Robillard was the one that you would want to have a cigarette with, not the other one.
Yeah, really an amazing artist, and one of the artists I admire the most.
Mm-hmm.
But I was very surprised actually, because I had this very similar point as you do, thinking of him as this person in the avant-garde regarding all his recordings he has made, and
sure.
how he was really at the front line of the organ music.
Mm-hmm.
And actually interviewing him, I found out that he's really, really strict following to a certain number of rules. So I discovered him from a totally different side, which was really surprising for me. I wasn't expected to hear that from him.
But I think that's and more academically and historically minded people than me will know these stories better. But I get the feeling that that's often the case with these players. They said of Messiaen, and it's a famous story, and I think it's basically a true thing, that of course Messiaen writes meticulously what the music is explicitly notated. But then he would play it apparently in a somewhat freer fashion, and somebody asked him about that, and he apparently said something to the effect that the performer has the right of performance as well. I may be confusing that with Jean Demessieux, but I'm 98% certain it was Messiaen. Someone will correct me or know the story. And it just goes to show that ultimately even the most academically principled people are still subject to the realities of the passage of time in the moment of performance, and the limitations of the human nervous system and everything else.
Yeah, and still, what would you say would be, if there is a young student who appears and plays his transcription of the whole Mahler symphony for a teacher at the high school, what you would say will be a good direction for his talent, not to get lost in this kind of tendency of having standard ideas and standard teachings nowadays?
I mean, you're asking me basically what would my advice have been for the then 18-year-old me, because that's what I was doing, and I gave him a copy of my Mahler transcription.
Yes, I know.
I guess the older I get, the less concerned I am in a way about the idea of pushing a student in a certain direction, because the reality is, almost all students want to be concert performers. Almost all organists want to be concert performers. Even those who pretend they don't will never lose the opportunity to mention in their bio that they played at the Berlin Philharmonie or something. So the intention is clear. Yeah. It doesn't matter how devout you are as a Catholic organist or whatever. Ultimately, you're still a concert organist, or want to be. And you would portray yourself that way if you had the choice. So it's the rare person who doesn't take that path. Most people do try to take it. And so, ultimately, of course, the person who succeeds at becoming a concert artist will do so because of a combination of skills that include their abilities as a musician, but many, many other things. And a certain amount of it will be simply how strong they are personally. I mean, just as a person. How I don't mean moral, but I mean how much abuse they can take from competition, from others, from the jealousy of others, and from the disappointments of life, which are legion on the path to establishing even the most minor significance as a solo musician of any kind. None of this is news, or should be. So, to the degree that I've been a teacher at all, and I'm not, and probably never will be, but I like to try to coach and help where I can. I don't think it's an interesting question, actually. How would one direct a student? Any student that has anything like the talent that it will require to achieve whatever promise seems to be there, will have to be able to make it on their own. So it's kind of not my business, In other words, it's sort of a self-solving problem. If you personally have the ability to be whatever it is that Alexandra Sasha Bartfeld becomes in 10 years, you already, are facing the choices now to become or not become, you're defining that path every day. And, one could spend years with any given teacher, and there will still be, at the end of the experience, a nice little mental journal of great moments and great things that were learned, but all of that is completely secondary to what the person themselves does. I've always taken an extremely independent view of what the student-teacher role is. It seems to me that the student is, of course, students need guidance and they need discipline, and all of that in a way should go out without saying, just as technique should go without saying. But it can only go without saying for the highest talents, you know. And again, one simply has to accept that reality that really, especially in the world of concert performance, it's talent that we're interested in. In music and in academia and in the world of the student, very much is made of the worship of work. We've all been told that, you know, it's whether it's by a teacher or by some banal little embroidered sign that you hang on the wall in your bathroom or whatever, that, you know, it's talent is all very well, but it's the work and it's what you do with it. Okay, yeah, that's true as a truism. But you know, work is work. It's just not that interesting on its own. Talent is what we want to hear, and it's talent that carries the day. And if the talent's not there, work as much as you want, and it will come to a certain level. It's actually that, you know, when people are lining up to buy tickets at a concert hall, they're not lining up because you worked hard. They don't care if you worked hard. They you know, of course you worked hard, but that's just book learning. You know, it still comes down to whether you have panache and ability, and of course it takes a certain arrogance too. You know, I think any organist, any young organist who's even slightly interesting, will have already taken a certain amount of abuse in their school and in their local community for being an arrogant young organist. Perhaps you've received some of this yourself, perhaps even more so as a woman. You know, was never a more arrogant young organist than me. And if you think I'm arrogant now, you should have met me when I was 19. I'm glad you didn't. I was just truly awful. And until comparatively recently, I've just been generally awful. But you know, the thing is, the organ requires arrogance in a way. It doesn't mean that you have to be a dreadful person, but it requires a strong personality. It just does. You know, you can hear instantly when someone is subservient to the instrument they're playing. And it's a world of difference from somebody who assumes the organ, whether it's the Cavaille of Rouen or Albert Hall, makes no difference. If you assume, you know, in your gesture of playing that the organ works for you, you can hear it. And that's what we want to hear. That's what I want to hear.
Oh, thank you for saying that. It's a really beautiful way of telling that.
Well, thank you. I mean, I think it's a little bit cruel too, but actually, again, why insult anyone's intelligence? I mean, why pussyfoot around the you know, the frank truth? One of the good things, one of the few things that, not few, but I mean, one of the interesting things about whatever my career is and whatever my position in the world is, that for better or for worse, I'm kind of out and independent of the usual academic and political strictures. That's not to say I don't get hit by them sometimes, but I have a little bit of independence, and so I do have, and I've wasted it sometimes saying silly things that I shouldn't have had, but still shouldn't have said. But I still have a certain kind of independence to be able to say, for instance, when an organ is bad, or when a certain thing is a certain way, or talking about conservatories, or talking about, as we should, you know, the student-teacher relationship and what almost everyone knows is generally wrong with it in most of the conservatories even now. The way that most teachers actually seem to want their students to just copy them, or seem to expect it. And also the way that it's very seldom openly discussed, because how could it be? It's enforced by passive-aggressive political maneuvering that goes on in the masterclass and in the lesson and in the experience over years. And
yeah,
I just think it's a kind of mental illness, actually.
Yeah, that's what I meant with, you know, and thought for a young, exceptional talent who will be definitely confronting all these recopying roles, which are
right away.
What, yeah,
right.
Which
Before
are
they
quite
turn
common. Yes, it's true. And actually, yeah, the personality, talking about the personality of a musician, which requires to have a certain stability and sensitivity at the same time to be able to stay musical and also face all these abuses, as you said. This is quite a point. And jealousy you mentioned. Do you think it's still an issue in the organ world? I think, you know, with nowadays it's getting better as far as I feel it, but every experience is so different.
I mean, I should be asking you that question because you probably are in the position of having to face it in a more in the trenches. Than you don't have the luxury of the sort of at least little bit of removal from that now that I do. At least I now have a team of, you know, people around me and a certain reputation, the smallest part of myself, as they say. But still, you know, I have some sort of inflation from that now, that most people don't get to have the privilege of that. So I'm kind of, you know, it's probably harder for you in that way, maybe. But no, I mean, jealousy amongst the organ community is a sad cliche at this point. And like most cliches, its ickiness comes from its truth. You know, it's just there. Now I've learned a lot about it. I have what you'd call a gaydar for jealousy. My gaydar, as they say, is actually almost non-functional in the usual sense. But when it comes to jealousy, I have a pretty good detector because I was getting jealousy of a very intense and direct kind when I was 5, 6, 7 years old. 11,
really?
10. Oh yes, very much, because as a young child when I was studying and you know, trying to carve my way out with the find organs in my own community in northwestern Pennsylvania and stuff. It was just one ludicrous slamming of doors after another. Then that can, you know, I got bigger and richer tastes of that when I went off to school when I was 11 and really started circulating in some kind of proper music community with exposure through the American Boy Choir School to, you know, the orchestral world, and then started being promoted by James Litton, who was the doctor of the director of the school, and, you know, in recital work and then in the concert work, and I was accompanying the choir, and then I started touring and doing stuff myself and playing some in Europe and kind of started. And I started transcribing and trying to compose in my little way. And yeah, I got an intensive and ongoing course in how musicians, and older musicians particularly, manifest their jealousy and how damaging it can be. Actually, it's amazing I wasn't more damaged by it. It's probably partly because of, again, call it the ego or whatever it is, but you know, just realistically, in order to not be beaten down by that, you have to have a certain sense of, I guess some people would say it's pride. I don't think of myself as very proud, because actually, you know, as much as any amount of hate I've gotten online or at any point in my life, you can be sure that I've hated myself more in some way, and that's also part of it. So you know, it's. Still, I have a very thick skin about those things, and skin can be thickened by experience, but it also has to be certain. You know, I was just blessed with a good thick skin about that stuff from the beginning.
And what I was noticing from my experience is actually matches a lot with what you're saying, because the jealousy. What I try to say that within a community of, let's say, my generation, we're kind of trying to support each other, and because we're all in the same boat. But facing the older organist, let's say, it can be challenging when you, as a younger organist, just begging for a little something and never getting it, or So it's still, I really hope that with the change of the generation, it will get better.
Well, I think they better stop begging. I think that you know, I'm trying to make an increased effort about this because I haven't myself, to be totally fair, and I'm sure someone could call me out on this. If they did, they would be right. I haven't spent all of my career being as open as I should have been. I mean, part of my push now to be open is because I realize that I have made mistakes in that fashion in the past. I've been I've put myself in an antagonistic position vis-a-vis the organ community many times, and it's just a waste of energy. A lot, you know, if you look back at the career of Virgil Fox, who's actually not an artist I admire in the slightest, but who had a very interesting career, you can see his constant fight, you know, and sometimes it seems like to me there's almost more energy went into that, and his war with the AGO, and his war with the organ scene, and his war with this and war with that, his war with the purists and all of this nonsense. You know, more energy went into that than into the playing. I think it's fairly clear, especially the older he got. You know, as the playing got worse, his mouth got louder. And that's just a disaster. It's a waste of an artist. It's a waste of energy. So I understand, you know, that it's my role. It's very important, especially now, for me to do everything that I can to support young organists, because the platform that I have, and by platform, I don't only mean, you know, social media. I don't have much, really, in the scheme of things. I don't have a large platform, but I do have my own organ, and I do have my own experience, and I have my recordings in a certain position, which is unique in the organ world, at least, and which can be shared with others as a pathway out of the rather limited sort of hamster wheel which the organ world can be, particularly in academia. And I do think it's very interesting, especially since even the pandemic, but also really in the last 2 years, I'm sure you can see this too, and in many ways I see you and Lucas and some of the rest of us, Thomas Mellon, and even those who are just really starting out with their social media work, but who are great talents of whatever kind. I think you can see that that there's a definite generational shift there between you know, the older artists who, it's not necessarily, many of them are on social media too, but you know, for somebody who is, let's say, of the caliber of the sort of god of the French organ loft, you know, somebody whose position of power in the tribune is unassailable, and who is, you know, an authority, and probably justifiably so in their own right, perhaps a great teacher, a great musical authority. And by invoking the tribune, it's not by accident that I'm hinting at the French organ world, because it is from the French that we get this structure mostly, and it comes down from Dupré and Vidor and Vierne and all of that, and there's much that's wonderful about it. But as we know from the relationship between Demessieux, for instance, and Dupré, there's much that's abusive and terrible about it too.
Oh yeah.
And there's much that should be dispensed with permanently. And it's interesting to see how social media is actually just taking care of that nicely for us, because somebody who has spent, say, the last 30 years as or 20 years as a major figure in the French organ world, say, or any organ world, but the French organ world is kind of really the position, you know, that's kind of the high water mark of this faux authority. Anybody who's like that, that position is actually not compatible, really, socially, with or image-wise, with the democratic, with what you and I are doing now, you know, with the democratic, tangible accessibility which social media not only requires for its genuineness, but also allows us. It wouldn't have been possible with me 2 or 3 years ago, because my personality just wouldn't have allowed it. I wanted to be above that until I saw that that's where the interesting stuff was happening, and also that it was actually a great way to show the world what I was really doing, just like what I'm doing with the touring organ now, you know. I mean, I'm just having fun, you know, typesetting and every little thing about the specification and putting out all the details, because really I'm a bigger organ nerd than anybody, and I know it's fun to see it, and I love looking over a stop list late at night as just as much as or more than anybody who collects every shred of information about everything, that all the Kavai Cole secrets and all that stuff, or whatever your focus is. Doesn't matter if it's Dom Bedos or Robert Hope Jones, it's all good. And so I just love sharing that. Social media is a great place to do that. If, however, you've set yourself up as an academic authority, you kind of can't get down into that, because all of us students are down here, with our, just doing it, and it doesn't fit the image. And so there's a big schism that's opening up there, where on one hand you've got all of us who are trying to push it forward, and then you have, in a way, unfortunately, I think we're starting to see more and more, you have this kind of older generation of the really, most of them absolutely great artists, but who will not be a part of that. And now that the pandemic has stopped more or less everybody's concert work, it's really down to who's creative to see who has a platform. And the people who are on social media and who are creative and who have talent are just going to zoom on out ahead. And that's what I really want to support.
Yeah, it's true that being in this academic position is kind of an isolation in itself also.
Well,
because
and look,
when you...
And Alexandra, just not to interrupt you, but I'm not trying to put down anybody in academia. Now, there are people who work their whole lives to get into academia, and who are there because they have a passion for history or historical performance or a given area of music, or whatever the region, the thing is. And those are all personal matters. It's as personal for any of those people to make their decisions as it is for me to believe that the right instrument for me is a digital rendering of a 1940s American municipal organ. What a bizarre thing, actually. But in a way, it's no more bizarre than devoting your life to 18th century French music or the works of Messiaen or anything. It's all just a matter of personal passion. And actually, people will find out the way and the venue and the medium and the instrument and the material that reflects their skill set and their talent best. Whether they need to justify it by saying that it's because of academia or historical performance, or like me, this is just what I do, and this is what this is the way that I can entertain you the best. That's it. I don't see that there's much distinction there. So I'm not looking to put anybody down, especially not any of our great respected older artists, most of whom actually I have, even where there might be some sort of distaste, for whatever reason, ultimately I can always respect somebody in the sense of a player. When you're playing, all of those other things can go away, and we can just receive the personality musically. It doesn't matter what the agenda is.
Of course. I will use this moment to say, you guys, if you didn't see the amazing series Cameron is doing about explanation of the touring organ, international touring organ, this is really an amazing thing, and thank you so much for doing that. It just blew my mind. I was watching it. It's really, for example, I've never touched an American style organ. Well, so even systems are very special for me. And
thanks. Well, yeah, this, the thing is, the touring organ, and it's largely my fault. It has not been well understood actually by the organ community, and it's been misrepresented many times. And of course, there are many times where it has had to play in a room which is not an acoustically favorable room, and also there are many times, for the first 2 or even 3 years of the organ, this organ is so unbelievably complicated. I don't mean just as an organ musically, but on the other hand, as a technical machine, and from the computer side, it is so very complex to use and to understand how to voice it and to make it better and to make it better and to make it better, as we always do with pipe organs too, that for the first couple of years of the organ, I actually didn't know how to install it. I was very much responsible for that organ sounding bad quite a few times. And so now but the good thing is, we never did release the stop list, and we never did do this. So now that the organ is pretty much finished and fully expanded to the full size that it was originally intended to have, 72 channels, it started out at 48. So of course, inherently, it now has more, it has more possibility to sound good. Now that that's done, I'm really having fun just opening up about the design and actually showing people that as complicated and horrifying as the console can look, especially to a traditional player, actually the core concept is quite traditional. It's just a tradition that isn't as well known in Europe and that is passé in a way, even in America, where most of the organs like that, some have been preserved, like the wonderful Koczmar organ in Maine was a big influence, Soldiers and Sailors Auditorium Chattanooga, and many of those, the big symphonic organs, and then some of them that are gone now, like the Minneapolis Kimball, the San Francisco Exposition organ, but even something like the Wanamaker organ, all of those instruments, you know, they're period organs too now. Those organs aren't, you know, except for Schoenstein. You know, the Conference Center organ in Utah is probably the closest thing to that tradition now. But those organs aren't really built anymore. So even for modern organists, they're not necessarily, you know, they're not necessarily a kind of a current thing. But they are just as much as Kavai Kol or Silbermann or any of these other traditions. That's a period of organ building too. You know, that's a great period. That's something that gives us the organ that we have today, and it's important for that reason. So I appreciate you mentioning that. I'm really having fun sharing that with folks, and it's also a gesture that's intended to interest young organists, so that when either the organ is traveling again, or when we have the ability to bring people here into Germany to see it, because I'd like to try to get more of a salon situation set up where you and anybody who wants to come and work on it can come and do a streaming recital, you know, spend a week with the organ and make your own sound for it. You could come and play your Vierne or whatever in your way with your sounds. And I think you would find that the organ would do what you wanted it to do and would not insist upon you playing like me. That's that's what makes a good design.
Definitely. And what is about this console, public console you've mentioned, which is, I think, in the United States?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's a second organ, there's a second system in West Palm Beach, Florida, at the major concert hall there, which is the Kravis Center for the Performing Arts. They commissioned they commissioned Marshall and Ogletree to install an organ as a permanent organ, and the donor was a Cameron Carpenter fan and loved the touring organ, and one thing led to another, and because they needed a general purpose organ, what was decided was that the touring organ design would simply be reproduced, given a slightly more conservative end user interface with the consoles. You know, it has a 32-note pedal board. Some of the theatrical stuff, like the percussions and stuff, are slightly rearranged, and the coupler matrix is rearranged, and so on. But the stops are the same. They're in the same place. Now, the organ is voiced very differently, but that's one of the interesting things about the platform and also about this design, is that, you know, and also about the digital organ, which is sort of part of my future vision for it, is that, you know, you could have as many copies of this organ as you had money to build. You could install them everywhere that you wanted to, whether there was a pipe organ in the hall or not, and they can all talk to each other. So anybody who is prepared to play a recital on one organ would be able to tour that recital to all of them. That was sort of a pre-corona idea that I never got developed, but the technology is there, and it could be developed at any time. It may well be in the future. And so, you know, my organ can be my voicing, their organ is their voicing. It's voiced by Doug Marshall, so he and I have different views of what the organ is and should be, but his are just as legitimate, and that organ's, I think, just as interesting to play.
So you mean it will be more, actually, as it seems to me now, closer to a conception of piano playing, where you have different but in the same way built and accessible pianos, which will not take that different work as going from Schuke to Kavai Kol.
Yeah, but I mean, again, you know, that's one of the things about the organ, which is an inherently self-limiting thing. You know, there's a great deal of head scratching and weeping and wailing and gnashing of teeth about why don't people go to more organ concerts, and why aren't there more organists in the future, and all this stuff. You got to realize that we're not living in the early 19th century. This is not a period at which people will come to one place where a musician is and hear the music there. The musician must go to everywhere the audience is. And because music is a globalized industry, of which classical music, of course, is a very, very, very small part, because it is a globally standardized industry, if you really want to be a concert organist, and you ever get the chance to be anything like a real concert organist, then you will quickly see that the expectation commercially from a real audience, by which I mean an audience composed of something other than exclusively organists, which is the audience for which most organists play, only for other organists in some way. When you find yourself actually playing for the public, you quickly see, and it's quite a frightening thing, that you will need to be able to play more or less the same music at the same level and in the same way and with the same degree of virtuosity and the same colors in South Korea, in South Carolina, in Southern California, in Southern Asia, in the Southern Hemisphere, in Russia, and it better all be as good as or better the same video that you yourself released of it and the album that you released of it. That's because that's what people will expect to hear. And no one but an organist would make an excuse for a player who showed up in Moscow and because they were playing a bad pipe organ simply couldn't give, and we've all been there, a convincing performance. You know, it's and of course the reality is also that, you know, as a traveling recitalist, if you're really you know, making dates, you simply don't have the luxury usually of going to wherever the pipe organ is, assessing what that pipe organ would best be served by, and then creating a program for that. No way. First of all, there won't be time, because if you're doing touring at anything like a level which would be commercially competitive enough to sustain the interest of a management, a real management, you will have to play enough dates that there won't be time to do that much work on each organ. You've got to be able to have an organ under control in about 6 hours, because you probably will only have that much time on the day, and then the next day will be a travel to another city with possibly a recital that night. Particularly in Asia, it works that way. You're playing in China, you know, then you will play every night for 12 nights or something like that, and you will high-speed train. And, you know, and that kind of thing, you can't be doing 20 hours of registration. When I played at the BBC Proms in 2012, I was fortunate enough to play 2 proms. And to do that, I did 36 hours of work over 4 or 5 days overnight. It's just not, you can't do that. You know, that's just not sustainable. So ultimately, that doesn't mean everybody has to travel with an organ. That's also impossibly difficult and also kind of not sustainable. But you know, it's a matter of deliverables. In the organ community, we tend to think in an organ-centric, not we, because I don't think that way. I've always resisted thinking that way. But most people seem to think in an organ-centric way, that what serves the organ best. You know, the organ is just the delivery mechanism for your brand. And every individual pipe organ can be a glorious, wonderful thing, but that doesn't mean it serves the brand. And if it doesn't, then you have a commercial problem.
So in this case, you're turning around basically the way of thinking of the biggest part of, let's say, organists that we, let's say, not that many people get to tour as much as you do, and spending 10, 15 hours on the registration. This is basically what everyone sees as a part of the job. So basically, with having this touring organ or moving organ becomes a more common thing, it will kind of steal a bit of a character at each. Like, you are going away from this point that every organ is different, and this is what gives this special taste to the profession and to the whole experience of being organist.
No, right, and Alexandra, it does, and I actually, if you read carefully what I say, in perhaps all but my most idiotic interviews, you will actually, if you read between the lines, you can see that I too appreciate that. As I've said, I like to say that nobody's a bigger organ nerd than me. I think I can prove that. What I mean is, I appreciate the pipe organ deeply. After all, the touring organ is a love letter to the pipe organ. We pulled together, you know, what I think are the best parts of about 33 different pipe organs to make an organ that wouldn't exist as a pipe organ, as the story goes. So I deeply appreciate that, of course, that it's the uniqueness of each organ that makes the experience. But that's the experience for us. That's the experience that you and I treasure as an organist. Well, that's all very well and good. It has nothing to do with the audience. If you want to have that experience, we can have that experience as organists without an audience. We can experience and treasure each individual pipe organ, and I will for the rest of my life. I'm never not going to enjoy going to see a new pipe organ I've never seen. I enjoy it every time. And there's always something I can learn. But this is a completely different subject than working as a concert organist for an audience. You got to, and the naivete of that position is that when you hear people incredulously, advocating for this idea that, of course, it's all about the uniqueness of each pipe organ. Yeah, for you as the player, but for the audience, and this is not a fun thing to hear. And it's anathema, I think, to most organists. But you got to understand, from the viewpoint of the general public, an organ is an organ. It doesn't matter if it's a digital organ, a pipe organ, a silver harmonica, Vicol, 18th century, 21st century. It makes no difference. The engagement is not with the thing that's hanging on the wall. The engagement is, and the buying of the ticket is for the person who walks out. And when the person walks out, they'd better not appear to be limited by, and they'd better not have to offer any previous apology for whatever it is that they're playing on this, in other words, whatever the machine is. From the standpoint of 98% of most audiences, it's largely irrelevant. It's the enjoyment that we have and the things that we learn and the experience that we have as a pipe organist is referential to our artistic experience. Don't confuse that with what is required to deliver a product to an audience. Sorry if it's getting a little dark here, but hopefully you can still hear me.
We can hear you. This is the most important thing. As an organist, we also don't always get to see the organist, but we have to. We can hear.
Yes. As ardent adherents of pipe organists, of pipe organs, I'm sure you don't need to see me, and it should be perfectly fine.
It's a pity still, but thank you anyway for being here even in the darkness. I hope it's not cold outside.
Don't let me talk too long. I want to answer some of those questions, and the thornier the better.
I would have, actually, it's good that you mentioned that, because maybe you've heard about it on the Organ Talk. We have a tradition of playing quick questions.
Oh, I've seen that many times, of course. I didn't know if we were going to get to that, so let's do that.
Yes, so I have them. It's composed
You want quick answers, right?
Yeah, I want quick answers. It's not always possible to say yes or no,
sure.
But let's go for like a sort of blissful. It's actually completely composed from the questions from the audience, so it's going to be that. Okay, what do you eat before the concert?
Oh, actually, that's a very good question. I got taken to task by some critics in Germany once for having to leave the stage of the Berlin Philharmonie because I was almost about to faint because I forgot to eat. Well, I eat quite a stringent diet, actually, because I have a very intense gym routine. And so I basically eat a lot of protein, not too much carbs. I never drink alcohol at any time, ever. And I eat very little sugar. So it sounds a bit ascetic, I know, maybe it is. So before the concert, I do try to get some protein in, a little bit of grilled chicken or some ground beef or something like that. And my go-to is sweet potatoes because they're long carbohydrates. But I highly recommend a whey-based protein shake. I personally take creatine, which is sort of a booster for people who lift weights. Creatine is good because it encourages water retention in the muscle, which is really good in preventing cramping during performance. And obviously you can drink as much water as you possibly can. I almost always mix BCAAs, which stands for branch chain amino acids. It's another gym thing where it's kind of basically a sports drink, and there's many different kinds. Usually it's like a fruit punch taste, but you mix it into the water, and it floods your system with amino acids and electrolytes, and that's really useful. Also for the brain during playing. So yeah, definitely you want to try to eat well before a concert.
Next question is, what would you do if you will never become an organist? What will you do?
I can't really answer because I did, and so anything that else, assuming infinite universes, there are other Cameron Carpenters who never heard of the organ and so on.
Yeah.
If I had the organ taken away from me now, or if I somehow left it, which actually is a fantasy that I have on a basically weekly basis. Some days.
Thank you for being so human.
I'm actually an alien, but I do my best to imitate the human. I'm kind of a digital human.
Thank you for that.
Yeah, I would probably try to have to do something totally different than music. And if I were to leave the organ, I would leave music entirely and never come back, because what would be the point? I don't really have an answer, because anything that I would answer would just be based on my other sad little skills besides the organ here, which are also totally organ influenced. So I actually don't know. Probably I've said this before, and it's probably the best answer I could be. I suppose I would be a vagabond of sorts. I would end up hitchhiking and just, smoking weed and traveling around and just doing nothing.
Like very Jack Kerouac style.
Something like that. Yeah, it sounds good. I may yet do that. Okay,
that sounds cool. The next question, which came from the audience, is what was your biggest disappointment in your career?
Well, I mean, the whole career, in a way. I mean, if you look at the things that I said, when I was 20 and 21 in interviews and stuff, when I was just starting out, and then even 10 years ago, I just had a much bigger ambitions. And I haven't left my ambitions, but I've settled down to realize, and I realized actually about 8 years ago, I realized around the time that I played those proms at the BBC that it just wasn't going to happen for me in the way that I had wished, that an organist is not a pianist, that even with the building of the touring organ, which was then finally starting to come together, the inherent economic and logistical challenges of the touring organ are so enormous that even if I were to start out at the same level, even if somehow tomorrow morning I were to be handed Long Long's career, or whatever, which is an unfair comparison to Long Long, and he's a very good guy, by the way. But what I mean is, if I were suddenly to be given 10 times the career I have, I would still have the staggering disadvantage of having to own this thing, which is my fault. I'm not complaining, and I love it. But an organist can simply never be competitive in that way, and so I mean. My disappointments are my own. My major disappointment is myself, of course. I just, I'm in many ways. I disappoint myself musically all the time. I wish that I were more well-rounded. I look at somebody like Thomas Mellon, who I think may be on our chat even now, who seems to have a limitless capacity to absorb every kind of music, including all of the musics which are the most confusing and disconcerting to me, like Rameau and Couperin and so on one hand, and then Messiaen and Webern and all of the modern things.
Webern, which was amazing.
Yeah, a staggering Webern, but everything, Xenakis and all even weirder things, plus his own music, and seems to have a preternatural understanding of atonality, which for me is horrifying actually, and he takes to, I don't know, Stravinsky or Xenakis, as I took to Leroy Anderson, Howard Hanson, Granger, Elgar, and so on. So, I just don't have, I just have these vast swaths of ignorance and tiny pinpoints of comparatively irrelevant, ability. And I also, of course, have had to take such a strong stand on what to do to develop my career to the degree that it went with the building of the organ, and I don't regret that. But you know, it's a big question mark to me whether, for instance, I will ever play a concert at Saint-Laurent or at Saint-Clotilde or these places or any of the organists that you know, and would I even be able to? For instance, that organ at the Chapelle Royale, you know, I played that organ when I was 11 years old or 12 years old. Oh yeah, I know that organ, and I know why you love it too. It's an amazing thing. But I couldn't give a concert on that pedal board. Are you kidding me? I mean, what should I do? And who should really want to hear me play a tierce en taille? It's for the same reason that I'm so critical in a way. It's a twist of the same problem, but you know, it's why I'm so critical of the idea of teachers wanting seemingly their students to sound like them, and horrifyingly, the students seemingly being willing slaves and only too willing to try to sound like their teachers. You know, if I want to hear Olivier Latry play
I'm so sorry, we have 30 seconds.
Oh yeah.
And then it will
Are we going
go
to reset
down.
and continue?
We're going to reset in a minute. Just
because
in a minute.
I want to finish that point. Let's
Yeah,
let's
I want to
that
hear,
point.
but we will not be able to.
See you in a second.
We'll restart right now.